a summary about racism and similarity in psychotherapy by Richard Tan. This production of NoteBookLM summarizes the key themes, ideas, and facts presented in Richard Tan's 1993 paper, Racism and Similarity, Paranoid-Schizoid Structures, focusing on the unconscious dynamics of racism within psychotherapeutic work. Core thesis and main arguments. Tan's paper argues that unconscious racist feelings are prevalent in psychotherapy, particularly when the therapist and patient are from different racial backgrounds. Racism functions as a primitive defense mechanism, specifically lodged at the paranoid-schizoid position, which obstructs therapeutic growth. It is imperative to interpret racist feelings within the transference relationship to facilitate the patient's emotional conflicts and deepen the therapeutic process. The central concept explored is that racism is an inability to accept and acknowledge difference without attempting to control and dominate the object that is felt to be different and separate. This control aims to reinforce a fantasy that the quality of separateness does not exist, leading to a distorted, omnipotent feeling of similarity. 2. Key concepts and theoretical framework. A. Racism as a defense against difference and dependency. Destruction of difference. Racism, at its core, is a defense against the painful feelings of difference. When these defenses succeed, difference is destroyed and there is no dissimilarity. This is often seen in racial conflicts where clear rational thinking becomes impossible and extreme hatred and violence are used in an attempt to wipe out any source of difference. Infantile origins. Difference is perceived as a constant reminder of the painful early infantile experience of impending loss of the good breast, which for some infants is unbearable. To manage this threat and avoid acknowledging dependency needs, the source of difference must be denigrated, perhaps annihilated, or made similar. Omnipotent similarity. The creation of similarity is based on infantile fantasies of introjective controlling of the object, as well as projective identification with it, Klein 1946, Bion 1959, 1962. This primitive level of functioning obstructs development. B. Paranoid-Schizoid structures. Racism is a defense firmly lodged in the paranoid-schizoid position. This implies that it involves primitive defenses such as splitting, denial, and projective identification, where good bits are always under threat of being expelled due to excessive projection. In racial conflicts, the threat to one's quality of life would be eroded due to the presence of a different people, leading to the destruction of difference for the survival of the self. C. Transference and countertransference. Cruciality of interpretation. The paper emphasizes that in therapy with racially different individuals, the bringing about of this difference becomes crucial as cultural and racial differences are such fertile and receptive areas for projections. Unless these feelings are brought into light via transference interpretations, the therapist/patient relationship becomes stuck and very little growth can take place. Therapists' role and challenges. Therapists, like patients, bring their own prejudices. For a non-white therapist in a predominantly white society, navigating covert and sometimes overt prejudices and discriminations is constant. It is difficult to escape the immediate pressure of racist material from patients to think with clarity, as everything is felt to be immediate and concrete. Rejection as a defense. Patients may reject therapists from different racial backgrounds, out of hand, to cling to these defenses. The reason often given is that a therapist from another culture might not be able to understand the patient's feelings, but this masks an inappropriate attitude to differences. Therapist self-awareness. It is vital that psychoanalytic psychotherapists have the ability to examine their own unconscious feelings and fantasies about racial difference, so as to be less influenced by their own omnipotence and, in turn, by that of the patient. Failure to do so undermine our therapeutic efficacy. D. Identification and distortion of reality. Primitive identification. Identification at a primitive level involves regarding objects that are similar as the same, and this omnipotent form of fantasy gives rise to a confusion between self and object. This is distinct from the sophisticated achievement of recognizing similarity with an external object that has its own existence. Assumed similarity. When both therapist and patient are of the same racial grouping, an assumed similarity is based on perceived reality, especially so when the therapist may be having countertransference feelings in this area of the patient's pathology. This can lead to overlooking racial difficulties in assessment and referral, amounting to exploitation of the patient arising from the assessor's ignorance. 3. Clinical illustrations. The paper presents 3 clinical cases, patient A, B, and C, and an example from a group supervision session to illustrate these themes. A. Patient A, denial of difference through idealization. Profile, white community worker, outwardly anti-racist, but harbors unconscious racist feelings. Defense, initially used the therapist's non-white identity to validate his own anti-racist persona, creating a sense of validity for the job that he does and reinforces his denial of any racial feelings in him. He projected unwanted parts of himself onto the therapist, fostering an ideal space where they were similarly doing something positive and constructive, denying his devalued and rejected parts of himself. Breakthrough, the therapist's interpretation of his hostility and boasting as an attack to disarm me from doing him any good, and an assertion of superiority, because the therapist, like his clients, was not white, led to significant anxiety. The patient felt persecuted and pained by his intense feelings of inadequacy and inferiority when forced to confront the difference between them, particularly when the therapist used a word he didn't understand. Outcome: acknowledging the difference allowed him to see the therapist as a separate person capable of containing his projections. This led to depressive anxieties and the eventual revelation that his ex-girlfriend was from Southeast Asia, an omission he initially deemed unimportant. This highlighted the therapist's own lack of awareness of racist feelings. B. Patient B, denial of difference through superiority. Profile, white European social worker, struggles with her own accent and command of English, but believes she speaks near-perfect English and feels equal to her English friends/colleagues. Defense, complained about not understanding the therapist's accent while being unaware of her own. She claimed to feel equal and somewhat similar to the therapist in the transference, but was secretly feeling superior and patronizing. Her association with black friends was used to portray herself as a liberated and intelligent white woman. She believed black and white were only significant in the political sense, denying personal impact. Breakthrough, after establishing difference, she was able to acknowledge that she felt ashamed that I had a better command of English than she did. Her assumption that her European background should grant her closer affinity to English and the therapist's non-European status imply lesser understanding was a fantasy. Outcome: this acknowledgement of difference allowed her to take back disowned and devalued parts of herself, leading to a more integrated self and the painful admission of her own racist feelings. She became more able to accept her own foreign identity and less threatened by the pain of her infantile needs. C. Patient C, destructive omnipotence and splitting. Profile, Eurasian man, mid-30s, with anxieties about racist attacks and being incapacitated. Identified with negative narcissistic traits. Rosenfeld, 1987. Defense, exhibited omnipotent fantasies of being anyone he wanted to be, including white, Pavarotti, or black, John Barnes. In being white, he identified with the westernized part of me, creating an atmosphere of similarly felt superiority, thereby destroying any difference. In being black, he identified with the foreign me, which was felt to be similarly inferior, so that we could both wallow in our sense of uselessness and despair. This controlled the therapist and prevented the therapist from being seen as beneficial. Denigration and projection. His dreams portrayed the therapist as boat people or a gook, illustrating his denigration of the foreign/Asian part of himself and the therapist. He projected his useless, lazy, black immigrants onto underground workers, blaming them for his predicaments and refusing to acknowledge white workers in that mood. He used splitting to survive, holding his good, white part at ransom by the bad/destructive, foreign/black part. Breakthrough, through interpretations of his racist feelings towards the therapist and his own Asian part, he realized that what he took from the therapist was felt as second-rate, reflecting how he felt about himself. This similarly inferior feeling was controlled by his omnipotent attacks and devaluation of my abilities. Outcome: this realization enabled him to recover some Asian parts of himself, acknowledge some goodness in the therapist, and experience a slight sense of depression, a taking back of devalued/inadequate parts of himself. D. Group supervision session, parallel process, and evading difference. Scenario: a student presented a case of a patient whose non-white husband planned to return to his country, a decision that caused the patient ambivalence. Defense: the student and the group were initially lulled into believing it wasn't a serious issue. When the date was set, the group became increasingly concerned for the plight of the student's patient, with racist overtones directed at the husband and his culture. Clear thinking was lost, and the focus became the need to rescue her from her predicament. Parallel process: the supervisor, Tan, realized he was also treating his supervisee as a possession, swept along by the trend. He identified a parallel process where the group's persecutory anxiety related to the supervisor's foreignness and non-white identity and emphasis on transference was projected onto the patient's husband. This externalization allowed them to avoiding the very obvious difference between them and me and its implications for them. Outcome: the spell was broken when the parallel process was pointed out, revealing how the group had become victims and the supervisor their persecutor, mirroring the patient's perceived victimization by her non-white husband. The student's identification with her patient was an attempt to avoid disintegration within herself and losing a training case. 4. Conclusion. Tan concludes that the pathways to creating similarity are varied, ranging from idealization, patients A and B, to destructive omnipotence, patient C. Regardless, racism is fundamentally an inability to accept and acknowledge difference without attempting to control and dominate the party, object, that is felt to be different and separate. It is a primitive defense against the annihilation of the self and the erosion of one's quality of life. The paper strongly advocates for therapists to engage in self-examination regarding their own unconscious feelings and fantasies about racial difference to counter both their own and the patient's omnipotence. By doing so, they can effectively maintain and work with the transference in bringing about acknowledgement of difference between therapist and patient, thereby enriching the therapeutic relationship. Denying difference, while more comfortable, ultimately undermine our therapeutic efficacy.